So, our final meeting. Okay, and it's noon. So, hi everybody, welcome to the final meeting. And today we're gonna, actually, I would like to talk a little bit about people's thoughts about kind of how it went and how the Obsidian experiment went and all of that, as well as sort of last thoughts about the actual content in the final chapters. But do we want to start with the final chapters? Because they finally said a couple things and maybe didn't prove their point as much as I would have liked them to. They did seem to open, I mean, it seemed like even in the final chapter, they're opening up new cans of worms. So how do people feel about the way they ended it up?
Well, Mike, you must be pretty keen.
Oh my goodness, is it? I have a reputation. I was only at one morning meeting. I was curious to hear what others thought, but I'm more than happy to share my views, and I can do them pretty concisely. Okay.
All right, go.
So I've been thinking about this book nonstop, and every day I think about it differently. So whatever I say is necessarily preliminary. I still think I need to digest it further. And I want to preface it all by really thanking Dan for organizing this, because I found it to be an extraordinary experience. I had read Debt the first 5,000 years, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago I read it. And I felt that that was one of the most exciting books I had read ever. Mm-hmm. But I do have a bit of a same kind of feeling now. I didn't read Debt as carefully as I'm reading this book, Dawn of Everything. But when I finished Debt, I tried to review it, and I had trouble making sense of what Graeber's positive position was. What I loved about reading Debt the first 5,000 years was the way he devastated what everybody else says about money. Mm-hmm. That first we had barter, and then we had to come up, with some, what do I do if I have lots of apples and Dan has lots of acorns? Right. And we want
shoes after all.
And I want some acorns, but Dan doesn't want any of my apples. So the whole medium of exchange, store of value, unit of account, he just devastates that by just bringing up this anthropological data. And I was like, wow, I've never seen anyone do this. It was just eye-opening. But then he went on and on and on about all this other stuff, and I really wasn't quite sure what he was saying other than everybody else is wrong. So this time, I saw him making 3 basic moves. One move was a genealogy of freedom. And without going, without me doing like a whole lot of study, I found it rather convincing. I haven't done a deep dive into the facts, but the genealogy of freedom was this whole idea that Enlightenment views of freedom were emerged out of the indigenous critique of Western civilization. So I found that to be wonderful, and that was worthy of a book in itself. And so that was the first move, the genealogy of freedom. The second move was a criticism of existing social theory. And existing social theory says that freedom or its absence is dependent upon something other than human will. That's what social theory says today in the West. Freedom or its absence, which is a political question, depends on something other than human will. And that something might be economic modes of production, it might be material forces of production, it might be ecology, it might be geography. What did I miss? I don't know. But those are all independent variables. And what they explain, according to traditional social theory, is freedom or its absence. And I thought they did a really impressive job showing that you can look at all of these independent variables, geography, economy, forces of production. Oh, scale of cities. I left that one out. Scale of cities. You can look at all of those things, and I can give you examples of contradictory political structures. So you can have, for any given independent variable, geography, city density, economic modes of production, forces of production, for any given independent variable, I can show conflicting dependent variables. I can show sometimes there's property, some private property, sometimes there isn't. Sometimes there's a lot of freedom, sometimes there's very little. So I was really impressed with their genealogical argument about the origins of freedom. I was really impressed with their takedown of contemporary social theory and how it just doesn't make any sense. What I am less clear on is the theory that they seem to be proposing. And here's where I'm less clear. They seem to think that they are presenting us not only with a scientific explanation of our past and our present, but that they are presenting us with and they use this word, we are optimistic. That, this is not only a political analysis from a scientific point of view, but it's also a moral political analysis as to how we should structure our future, and that we should be optimistic that we can be. And here's where I'm confused. Ultimately, I find them saying this about Rousseau. Rousseau was right about one thing and Rousseau was wrong about something else. Rousseau was right in saying that history so far is a story of regression, of things getting worse. And I don't think I'm making this up. They say again and again, we are stuck. The question we have to answer is, why did things get worse? So their overall picture of history is things got worse. And they agree with Rousseau that things got worse over time. Where they disagree with Rousseau is that Rousseau said, at one time, there was no domination, and now there is domination everywhere. And why do they disagree with that? What they say is there was always domination. From the very dawn of history, of humanity, to the present, there was always domination. What our theory has done is made a complex situation more accessible to us intellectually because we differentiate degrees of domination. So it was never the case that domination was absent from human history. That's where Rousseau made an error. But what we did go is from a situation where domination was always present, but only in a first or second order, to it sounds like they're saying since the late 18th century, to now, and since the late 18th century, where everywhere there is third order domination, the modern state. So that's why history is a story of regression. We always had unstable forms of domination, which was good because they were unstable. But now we are stuck in a situation where domination is stable. So that's what stuck means, right? It can't, it's lost its fluidity, it's solidified, it crystallized. So I think I understand that. What I don't understand is why they think this is optimistic. You know, they say Pinker is fucked up. Why? Well, Pinker sees progress in history. Hobbes, they think he's fucked up. Hobbes sees progress in history. Why does Hobbes see progress in history?
Well, Pinker sees value in hierarchy. That's why he's fucked up.
Right. But, you know, that's what Pinker does. That's what Hobbes does. Hobbes says, look, there was always domination, but now we're better off because we have the Leviathan state. Now, we all know it. They don't, you know, just like they thought Rousseau had one thing right and one thing wrong, I think they would say the same thing about Hobbes. What Hobbes had right is there was domination in the original dawn. What Hobbes got wrong is Hobbes thinks that a Leviathan state, a modern state, a third order state is, you know, good. So anyway, what I'm saying is if you have a regressive view of history, which they do, I do not find that to be consistent with optimism. So
okay.
That's where I am today.
Okay. I wrote some notes and I will respond, but anybody else want to respond to Mike?
Just the only thing, Mike, that comes up for me is the optimism is about, because part of one of the themes for me in the book is this kind of failure of the imagination, the failure of a researchful imagination, and just in general, a failure of the imagination. And yet the optimism for me comes in the possibility that there are other imaginable futures, that there are other ways of being. And so I don't see it as a kind of regression. I see it much more that they're saying there's oscillations that have gone on through history. And then if we take ourselves into the distant future, perhaps we can look back on this possibility that there are other. And so that's where I sort of saw that there are other possibilities, that we're actually this third freedom, the freedom to imagine other social structures, other ways of being, is a kind of that's the optimistic streak or aspect. That's how I read that anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would tend to agree with that. I think the oscillations. I think as an archaeologist and an anthropologist, they might argue that the oscillations and that one that we're talking about of the stuckness of the three reinforcing types of power in the last 200 years. It's only 200 years. Right. So for an archaeologist, you know, maybe that doesn't seem to be as pessimistic. I mean, it is the last 200 years, I would agree with you, Mike, is kind of a declensionist story. But I'm not sure that they would go there. I thought one of the things that they did, you sort of kind of laid it out as these three moves, the genealogy of freedom, the takedown. And I think that's Graeber's biggest strength, right? That he's a great takedown artist. The optimism, the coming out of it, the idea of charity in one of the final pages, you know, just this, you know, this charity, which would enable the hospitality and the ability to run away and go someplace else. I didn't know that was as strong as it might have been. Nate, looked like you wanted to say something there.
I was just gonna kind of echo Simon and like that. I think a lot of like where we are presently has a lot to do with, you know, this failure of the imagination and also like the weight of history and like, you know, preconceived notions about this is the way things are. And so by servicing all this archaeological data about other ways that humans have organized their lives, since like one of our prime failures of imagination these days is we can't imagine other than this. And even if we can imagine something, everybody just blows it off in, kind of like our society rife with cynicism as, sure, that's a nice idea, but that's not realistic. Like there's no chance that anyone could actually pull that off. And so I think by, continually showing, hey, look, there's been all these other ways that people have successfully organized what it means to be a human being, some of which is much more durable than, the 200 years we're talking about right now. So, hey, maybe we can explore some other options.
Mm-hmm. There does seem to be a fear that, not everybody can be vegan, right? Because the planet can't support it, right? So everybody, so we can be vegan and everybody else has to eat Burger King. So that does seem, and there does seem to be sort of that suggestion as well. One of the things that I found about this that we've sort of gone back and forth over, over the past several weeks is this idea of, all of this evidence, excuse me, that they're laying out. And I've been sort of, because I think they do it fairly well, and they sort of weave it into their argument very well. I'm thinking about, for example, when they're talking about in chapter 11, they're talking about the Hopewell interaction sphere. And so I started, I actually went to the, because it's hard in Kindle. So I actually opened up the book and I was like looking at each of their, their endnotes one after the other and the sources that they were citing and stuff. And, based on that, I think that this book is going to spur a lot of historians. I mean, all the stuff that they're citing is mostly archaeologists, anthropologists, right? So I think this is going to spur a lot of historians to kind of look into this and say, hey, wow, this is, somebody could write a synthesis of these things that kind of brings a lot of this into the mainstream more. I mean, they quote Carr and Case quite a bit. Christopher Carr and D. Troy Case, right, who are the Hopewell experts and have written, lots and lots of stuff. And the bibliography is full of their titles. Similarly, there's another author that they cite later on, and again, you look in the bibliography, and there's like a dozen books by this person and articles. And so I think that unpacking this is probably going to continue. Is going to be going on for the next generation.
I took a bite of my lunch at an inopportune time. Part of why, I'm not really concerned with them saying, okay, here's our theory, and look, it's so amazing, it's so revolutionary. I think the thesis, the underlying thesis of the whole book is hey, everybody else, all you guys, get back to work.
Yeah, and it did seem like for a long time that the stakes were so low because it was the distant past, it was prehistory, right? So if we just kind of gloss over it and we generalize a little bit more than we ought to, no harm done.
I definitely got my money's worth from it. I think one of the things we not only have been stuck from a political organizational perspective, but I think the problem, and I don't know that they necessarily need to say, okay, there's a problem with this and here's where we go. It's really, the value is taking the blinders off of, we're here and no one can see where do we evolve to, what is the adjacent possible that we go to next, or what's the next thing that we jump the hill and go to the next higher thing up.
Right.
So really, to me, the value is the arguments that take the blinders off. And I don't think they talk about it explicitly, but I think it's been an issue with the entire field of anthropology since its inception in Western culture. And it's kind of the idea of comparative anthropology, and is one culture necessarily better than another, or can they all just be different and fine? Because I think when you look at their argument, I don't know that it can possibly be the case that, let's use the US and China right now. The US's system is better than that in China, or versus maybe the Kung in Africa.
Mhm.
So given what they've said, we need to put more value into the ways other people choose to live and that freedom of choice. And then you can go and choose. Although the problem also becomes one of game theory of, from a warring state's perspective, and we want to rule and control you. It's the struggle between even the US and China. Who's going to win out, and does one economy collapse and then the other one moves in and takes over? Probably not. But a lot of it was underlined too this morning. There was an article, or I was listening to the radio on NPR. They were covering the Supreme Court, and so their argument about the three freedoms was interesting, in particular because they specifically said the Supreme Court right now, and one of the three more liberal justices said, because it was an abortion issue, was, we're up against the right to own and control one's own body. So it's literally, there's these three freedoms, and maybe we're missing the point on the third that they talk about. But in American political culture, we seem to be going reverse and actually losing freedoms rather than gaining them, which I find hilarious, because most of those on the right are the ones talking about, I have the freedom to do X, Y, and Z, when in fact, they're probably the least free of all the groups, or at least the way I view it within American political culture right now.
Yeah.
But I was like, wow, okay, that's...
Yeah. Yeah, in the chat, Nate said he's curious about what people are planning on doing with the mind, this information. Yeah, and I'm curious about that too. I mean, for me, I think it's going to make some subtle change. I mean, it already has made some. I've already made some changes in the way that I cover, the sort of prehistory in my little review before I start my modern world history. I think that probably I will lean a little bit more into these ideas about, in addition, because the approach in, especially in teaching US, right, is when teaching US 1, you sort of wave at the natives, right, and you say, oh yeah, before, there were these native societies, right? There was Cahokia, right? So you show a picture, you show that picture that everybody shows of the, of the illustration that's probably at the Cahokia Museum, and somebody, took a picture of it and stuck it in the public domain. But adding to that, just maybe another sentence, just a little twist that says, and there are, and at the same time, you've got this other thing going on. You've got these people in, what they call Iroquoian society, right, which begins to take shape about the same time as the heyday of Cahokia. And if you even open up, again, and this is your adjacent possible, Chris, right? This idea that, maybe there are people who are doing it differently, and maybe they're doing it differently self-consciously and deliberately, because they have looked at that and seen that, maybe that just opens up that window of possibility. At least I kind of hope it does.
I'd like to pick up on what Chris talked about in terms of cross-cultural comparisons in anthropology, because I do think that is essential in how to assess this book. So I just want to, I'm not going to read a lot, but I want to, I went back to chapter 1. So here's page 8 from chapter 1. The ultimate question of human history, as we'll see, is not our access to material resources, much though these things are important, but our equal capacity to contribute to decisions about how we live together. So there's an ultimate question of human history. And one last thing. Here's the question they ask. How is it that our innate drive for freedom somehow leads us time and again on a spontaneous march to inequality? So they're saying there's an ultimate question and there is a human essence. And this human essence is an innate drive for freedom. Now, I'm obviously, I have my own views. And when I read chapter 1 the first time, it's like, oh, great, because I really want to hear a knockdown argument how a better world is possible, one without domination. I definitely, emotionally, this is very appealing to me. Mm-hmm. But I want to figure out, how would I argue this with someone who doesn't have my emotional constitution, who doesn't share that with me? Mm-hmm. So Chris was talking about comparative anthropology. I am not sure how secure these foundations are, that the ultimate question for history is our ability to play with political forms, and how the fundamental innate attribute of being human is this freedom to alter our social structure. Just so we all know, I don't like the world we live in. I do think we live in a cage. I do think it's possible for us to change our social structure. And I really wanted these guys to give me a really good theory to justify my biases. But I'm not convinced that they've provided that which I seek.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think it would be difficult to do that, right? Because all along they've been arguing against this. I mean, part of the project of sociology, anthropology, right, is this generalization, right? And they're saying that this has been too facile in the past, right? And they're criticizing all of those generalizations and all of those, and I think, Chris, to some extent, cross-cultural or comparative anthropology would also be liable to that criticism, right? That we're looking for big answers, capital letter generalizations that we can say, okay, this culture is doing this culture is doing that. We can compare these things and we can understand something about them. Where, I mean, it seems like throughout each of these chapters, again and again, they're saying, okay, look at this, look at this very detailed example. It's different in all of these ways. So at the beginning, Mike, when you were kind of listing your, the different things that they were saying we weren't determined by, right, or undetermined by, material conditions, population size, population density, all of these different factors. It seemed to me that they were not conclusively arguing against any of those things being influences. They were arguing against them being straight deterministic causes. Right. And so the message, the message that I kind of got from it was that, yes, all of these and free will and play and, and the ability to kind of think beyond these, these boxes that we find ourselves in. And that would be a cause for optimism. But once they've, I guess my point is that once they've argued for all of this complexity and all of these different societies that in each of these chapters they've taken a look at being contingent right, and having agency, then as a sociologist or as an anthropologist, how do you, where do you plant your flag? Where do you say, okay, but we can generalize, to this extent? Chris says, yeah, do you want to talk about that, Chris?
Well, I think that was one of my, and I guess it's tangentially related, but one of my favorite parts, and it's always, I like going back and looking at some of the how we got here types of stories. And for context, I've been reading Braiding Sweetgrass at the same time as reading this, which is an experience to say the least. But she starts off Braiding Sweetgrass with the origin story of Turtle Island in indigenous American culture. And so it's a story of a woman who falls to earth and what becomes of her. And that origin story compared with the Adam and Eve origin story are so dramatically different. And when you compare and contrast the two, then you totally can see how how indigenous Americans became what they became and how the West became what the West has become. So if you haven't done it, just even go read that first chapter of that book. Mm-hmm. And you'll have gotten something out of it. But they talk in, I think it's chapter 12, about the linguistic origin of the word family and how it's tied up in, Roman law and culture and domination and even control of slaves. Mm-hmm. So it's odd to me to look at family in that framing, and even with linguistic drift over time, being able to look back at that original version of what the family is and I have grown up in the rural, deep American South in North Georgia in the Appalachians. I think I've mentioned before, but in the two towns where one was a first American gold rush that I think was an inciting incident for pushing the Indians out, because you can't own the land and take the gold out of it if you have Indians on it. And then in the second town I lived was the Cherokee Nation's capital, and from which the trail started and moved up and out. So that conception and culture there is very definitely a deeply Protestant and heavily Baptist focused one. And to a great extent, that idea of Roman family still exists, at least in that part of the country, to a very heavy extent. But having lived in New England, the Mid-Atlantic, and now in California, I see dramatically different instantiations of that concept of family that don't stem from that original Roman. So it's interesting, even within American society and culture, to see that kind of difference of family and how, we end up where we're at. But I think that, that was one of the more interesting, quirky parts of the book that I think a lot of people either don't see or don't get to because it's in the last chapter, unless you just read the first chapter and the last. But it's, that sense of freedom is underlined, I think, heavily there. And I from a comparative anthropology perspective, even within American society, it's dramatically different. So I don't know. Mm-hmm.
Dan, I wanted to ask you something.
Oh,
go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Now that Chris introduced the word Turtle Island, I just wanted to ask, can we say that one of the lessons that we learned from the last two chapters, at least, is that in general, from the lessons learned in some strange way, the later clans or the Indian groups, did they really, in general, they require, and the other groups, did they really inherit the three, or were able to enjoy the three freedoms that the book talks about in general, and up till the European society came there? And the second good thing that I wanted to ask Dan directly is, Dan, suppose you introduce this concept in your History 1 class as one of the parallel, would it be a parallel thread that you would introduce, or is it also one of the drivers of history, the class which you're going to take?
Well, I think that it would add some more specificity to just sort of this, as I said, we kind of wave at the natives and say, oh, weren't they nice, and weren't they peaceful, some people say, and people have all of these different kind of myths of all of that. I think that there was I think even the story that they tell in, I think it's chapter 11, right, of the neutrals, right, and the neutrals, they try to be neutral, right, between the Wendat and the Haudenosaunee, and they don't last long, right, because it's difficult to be neutral when these different polities are warring on each other. So I think it's always, imperfect, right, would be kind of a way that I would probably describe it in, even, but it does seem that there are that it wouldn't be a single story, like it was this way once with Native Americans kind of as a large continental group, and then it changed to this. There seems to be this moment with Cahokia where they peak around 1000 or 1050, and then and at that time, these people who become the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois Confederacy are maybe growing and maybe reacting to that. And this reaction and this I think that's the other major contribution that they make to the argument or to the discussion, is this idea of schismogenesis, right? That there are people who are sort of looking at what's going on around them, next door, and thinking that they want to make other choices, or and I guess maybe that's the question, right? Is it just we want to define ourselves as not them, right? And that seems to be because they talk in, I think it's in chapter 12, in the last few pages of chapter 12 about the idea of other people becoming equal targets, right? That the group, that when you're in conflict with somebody, then there are some societies that play, right, and have games of contest, and then there are other societies that have wars, and they don't really explain what differentiates those two, those choices, right? So why do you choose to say that these people can be, that these people who are your enemies can be killed, and then once you do that, does that make it easier to say that the people in your own group can be dehumanized to the extent of giving them orders, right? Because if the thing that distinguishes, the Iroquois is that the worst thing that you can do, the worst outrage, short of eating human flesh, is giving giving orders. So where does that disappear? And maybe it disappears with this. It seems like these forces are sort of in constant opposition to each other, right? The idea that we want to have more freedom for ourselves, and we want to define ourselves as people who are, who have these freedoms, and yet there are those other people, and we got to do something about them.
Comparatively, how would you, this presumes we all take on faith and as a basic tenet that these 2 or 3 freedoms that they're talking about are the actual goal. What if there's some other culture somewhere else that maximized on some other axis that had nothing to do with freedom, and maybe that's better? So, maybe we should even look beyond that to see what are the things are there, and are we missing something that's even better than freedom? Or can you take the idea of, a veil of ignorance, and instead of using it, it's classically used in tax policy. How do you create a tax policy without knowing who you're going to be? But if you're a society, take that veil of ignorance, and how do you decide what kind of society you're going to have? Because I think the problem is and mostly it's and I'll say it because I'm a member of the class, the cis white gender who want to impose their ideas on everyone else with the blindness of not knowing what they don't know. There was a Harvard professor in the business school yesterday, I think, who'd mentioned, she asked her students what the average American income was, and over a quarter of them guessed that it was 6 figures was the family income, when in fact it's closer to 45,000 a year, which is a huge amount. And apparently there was one who guessed the average American income was 800,000 a year. Like, wow, like you're really missing the boat, aren't you? But it's, if you had a veil of ignorance and you had to choose amongst all these societies that have existed before that we at least know about historically, then which one would you choose and why? Or a lot of Western philosophy has started with the concept from ancient Greece of, how do you maximize eudaimonia? And, we don't even in English have a really good way of translating the word eudaimonia at all. But, how do you maximize from that? And when did we in history stop thinking about how do you increase not only your happiness and enjoyment in life, but everyone around you? And I don't even think they came close to touching on that as a question.
Right. Yeah. Or what type of personal sacrifices would you be willing to make to improve collective? To improve the collective. Yeah. I think they do focus very much. They assume the individual and they assume freedom as kind of the goal. And they actually talk against. They say, in the Cahokia passage, right? They talk about this widespread movement against hierarchy, right? They call it. And they say, especially theocratic society governed by a hereditary caste of male priests who so systematically abused their power, particularly their abuse of women, that the people rose up and massacred a lot of them. And Chris, I can imagine that one of the alternate sets of values that people might follow would be, something that wouldn't appeal to me at all, which would be, some type of spiritual religious thing, but societies have been organized around those.
I think you just highlighted, Dan, what I think is one of the biggest weaknesses of the book, that they do not, in my humble opinion, sufficiently distinguish analytically agency. Right? They're all about free will, which they say, I don't know, now it's called agency, or used to be. I guess they say it used to be called free will, now it's called agency. Okay, so for a book that is voluntarist through and through, when I say voluntarist, I mean, right, it's all about we are free to choose. We exert our will. Now, you have to, in my opinion, you have to make clear who the agent is. And it's quite clear to me that the only coherent way to do this is to state that there are multiple levels of agency. Now, we're not talking about the history of everything. We're just talking about the history of the human species. So I'm going to ignore DNA and cells and tissues and organs, and I'll just say there are individual human beings, and then there are groups of human beings, and then there's the entire human species. And for me, this was a huge problem, Because when they talk about the three freedoms, when they talk about the three forms of domination, I think you must make some kind of allusion to what is the level of analysis. Now, like I said, I thought they did a great job on the genealogy. I thought they did a great job taking down existing social theory. I thought their social theory was weak. Do I have a full-blown social theory of my own? But, you know, I obviously don't. But I think they made a few mistakes, and I would remedy those mistakes. One, I wouldn't be talking about progress or regress. And I don't think that's petty. They keep saying again and again and again, the defining question is, why did things get worse? How did we get stuck? As far as I can tell, that is, that's fundamental to their worldview, that we're stuck. Now, I do agree with the point you made, Dan. In the scheme of human history, 200 years is hardly being stuck, right? But that is the way they frame it, at least as I read the book, and that is repeated again and again. So I would discard the idea of progress and take a more, you can criticize anything, but I would take a much more neutral scientific view and say, okay, how do we explain what is happening? And try to remove as much as we can, do we like it? Do we not like it? I mean, the reality is this is what happened. How can we explain it? And what I would say is it's clear that selection, and I'm going to use consciously Darwinian evolutionary terms, that selection occurs at multiple levels. Because this is what I thought they didn't deal with. They said, yeah, it has something to do with the family and it has something to do with caring. And how did we get stuck? Well, domination at the family level somehow translates into the state, but it's all kind of mushy. And what I would say is you have to distinguish the levels. There's the interaction between individuals. There's also interactions between groups and one group and another group. And I think you need to do that. And then what you have to say is human beings can select just the way nature selects. But of course, in Darwinian theory, there's multiple kinds of selection. There is sexual selection, there is artificial selection, and then there's natural selection. So human beings select, and how they select it is determined by all these other phenomena too, like, well, if we adopt this cultural practice, will we have enough to eat? Or if we adopt that cultural practice, will we be overrun by our enemies on the other side of the hill? So I think I think a social theory that they're maybe hinting at would be a better alternative, would be to say selection occurs at multiple levels. And yes, they interact in a complex way, but individuals select how they relate to their mates and to their children. Groups select, and then, nations select, and ultimately the species has to select. And our continued survival in the face of climate change might just depend on whether we have the capacity to function as a species.
But it's interesting, Mike, that you put it that way, because the thing that occurred to me, and I don't remember who said it. It might have been like Ezra Klein or Matt Taibbi or something, made the observation that that people are conservative Republicans at the national electoral level, and then okay, maybe soft Republicans at the state, at the governor's level, and then Democrats at the local level, and socialists in their family. So choices at different levels are not something that we seem to be good at talking about.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me, and I don't think there were other mentions of it, but I haven't done a search for it, but they really only get into the idea of complexity in chapter 12, I think, in terms of, and I think they discuss it more in the impact of, in this evolution of societies and polities that we've just disproven, there's the idea that as things become more and more complex, you need more and more complexity to run and govern and set things up. When in reality, I think a lot, and I'm presuming because they don't go into it, they're not, and because of their academic specialties to begin with, they're not well versed in the ideas of what complexity theory is and how it's grown up in the last 20 or 30 years, even much less, in the early 1900s, I think we see the beginnings of seeds of that science, but it's not really until the late 70s, early 80s that it started to become a thing. And even then, it's, as an academic specialty, it's now just become a thing probably in the last decade. But the tough thing they don't see or don't realize is usually you can build a huge amount of complexity from some very small, tiny building blocks. And it's what are those tiny building blocks that then result in the complexity you see later. But I think that, in comparison to Mike's point, and because I've got 20 linear feet of texts on evolutionary theory right behind me, we have to mention it. But none of us have grown up in a vacuum, so that your political structure is also contingent upon the structures around you and how you're influenced either within the walls you call your nation or your country, and the ones that are outside of that. So whether it's the neighboring tribe or the neighboring country, you get into bigger issues of how do you maintain, if you're going to maintain three freedoms, let's say, how do you do that in a structure where the group next to you only believes in one freedom and they're coming for you now? And that becomes a much harder thing to deal with from a complexity perspective. How do you maximize those freedoms both for yourself or let's say, from an American perspective, in our crazy exceptionalism, we want to export our semblance of democracy to every other country, or have, for several hundred years, or we want to be, the phrase, the world's policeman.
Or we say we do, yeah.
Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? And that also kind of circles back around to that comparative anthropology. Sure, we may think we know best, but we're also abutting, in terms of world and historical politics, we're coming up against a multi-century barrier that most polities have never passed. So, Rome
great filter, if you will.
Most of Rome's stages, I don't think they got past 400 or 500 years in any of them before their public. The kingdom changed, and then it was a big look of democracy, and then it was a republic after. But each of those are three separate stages, and then it completely collapsed. So I think maybe I'm trying to, probably the two largest polities, I think, were Genghis Khan's empire, and maybe second after that was ancient Egypt in terms of space and land and peoples. But we're from a historical perspective, America is running up against that wall of longest running polity, as well as one of the larger areas governed. And we've, since the early 1900s, have consciously, I think for mostly racist reasons, decided to stop expanding, or at least expanding the way we were expanding.
Well, or we've shifted. I mean, and I think that's something that I think they don't deal with as well as they might as well. Additionally, is the way we define these terms, right? Because maybe, I don't think that imperialism really ends. I think that it shifts from being military and political to being economic, right? And so and domination sort of gives way to hegemony, right? And so, but the thing that I wonder about is because of where, I don't know about Wengrow's politics, but especially where I imagine Graeber is coming from, this idea that these freedoms are experienced by people in the same ways, and that we should be offended by these challenges to these freedoms, in that they are challenges to our well-being. And so some people might not perceive, as an extreme example, social credit as a challenge to their immediate well-being. Ultimately, it may turn out to be one, but how do they deal with kind of those questions? What do people actually, and it seems to me that's another additional layer of complexity, right? That they can't really get at, and that that even with all of these really substantial, layering of interpretation by the leaders in their field, dealing with the Iroquois or the Wendat or any of these peoples, can't really know, right? Is that how did they perceive it, and what choices were they making based on what values, and what were their hierarchy of values and needs, and how did they feel they were being addressed or not? Lewis, you just kind of popped in after being dark for a while. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I think Mike said it really well. Mostly, I would say that a lot of information, and it was quite hard for me to process the book. I think it could. But it was a good read. I'm interested that this order of states was quite an interesting idea. This first order state, second order states, and here we are in a third order state. And I was wondering if there was a third order state that had some we're now in this iron cage, as they described, in this third order state. Is this third order state the iron cage, or is there a third order state that gives us some greater freedom?
Or the one where we pit the sources of power against each other?
Yeah. So,
or maybe are we already doing that?
Yeah.
If you look at
American elections.
Well, going and looking at Colin Woodard's thesis of the 11 American nations in the book American Nations, you've got essentially 11 different sub-polities that are active in the United States, and probably even more. Some have broken out or changed subtly in the 250 years. But you really have 11 different sub-nations, and the question is which ones are banding together in which election cycles for which reasons, for us to end up with the national leadership that we do. So it was interesting to me to read even some of the social theory of people who in times of difficulty and turmoil, or perceived turmoil, you may choose some total psychopath to be your leader, because that psychopath is the right psychopath for the time to either get you over whatever that hump is, and then maybe things break down after that and you go back to kind of a new normal.
Well, and along with that, the 11, the Collins 11, or there was a previous book, The 9 Nations of North America. So it's an idea that I think, the regional identity is something that has been sort of that has been brought up again and again. And so my question would be, to where the rubber actually hits the road for people, how much of it is, how much of this national leader thing is symbolic and how much of it is actually really relevant to how they perceive their well-being on a day-to-day. I mean, maybe not how they perceive but their actual well-being. And there's some type of relationship between those things that is not simple either, right? Where do people want to, what does it mean that people want to focus on, sort of these big symbolic causes, right? That may or may not actually be, for example, my family is not, I do have 3 daughters, but right now my family is not directly affected by whether or not abortions are legal in Minnesota. It may be in the future, right? But that issue is current today for a lot of people. And yeah, I'm curious.
Or even from a historical American perspective, you free the slaves and then suddenly you give them the ability to move around and additional freedoms they didn't have. And suddenly you have the great migration out of the South all over the rest of the country, which in itself becomes a mini experiment of where are those best places to go and move and leave, right, when you're that person with that culture and you can then go anywhere within the US.
Yeah.
For
and then you get the bloody summer of 1919, right? When white soldiers come back and they want their jobs.
Yeah. I'm stuck in California because of family ties with my wife. But when her parents are no longer around, then, and I've had the benefit that I've lived in almost all of Woodard's 11 nations, or most of the majority of them. And I can certainly say there are some sections of the country that I would prefer to live in over others. But what happens when, and I think the tough part too, for a lot of places within, at least an American political perspective, you have leaders who are saying, you can't have an abortion, and so we're going to legislate against it and get rid of it. But those same leaders are exactly the same ones who have the wealth and power to go across state lines or go somewhere else,
right,
and do the thing that they're vitiating against, which, that kind of politics drives me bonkers. It's like, if you can't live by the rules you're, instituting, you can't take credit for them. There was, I think, an example, I don't know which state she was from, but a hardcore Republican the other day who voted against Biden's, financial package. But then as soon as it goes through, she turns around as taking credit for all this infrastructure she's bringing to her state because we've got all this money now. And I'm like, but you didn't vote for it. Like,
yep,
you shouldn't be able to benefit from those things if you're not actually for them.
Yeah. But but we do have kind of a I was just thinking that too myself, Simon. We do need to probably transition at some point to kind of we got a half hour or so left. Do we want to talk about?
I wasn't suggesting that we stop that conversation, by the way, just to be clear, because especially because I'm living in a country where the Prime Minister was throwing parties during lockdown. So, he didn't have to cross any state lines. He could just have them out his backyard.
Right. Rules apply to other people. But that's something, and that actually what I was going to say to Chris was that we sort of agreed that shouldn't be, that's not legit. That is a cute puppy.
Big puppy.
I think it's worth throwing in here, like the classic move of people in power to like create divisions amongst, those not in power. So they're more easily, so that they can never effectively rise up against the people in power, right?
Yeah. Yep. Labor versus the farmers.
Yeah. And I wonder, like, how, because you look at lots of other whatever industrialized nations, like abortion is not, that's not something people are arguing about. It's like, yeah, we figured that out like a long time ago. And I wonder how much of like the weird politics we deal with in America is just ways of subdividing society so that we can never actually really change anything.
Yeah. So where does schismogenesis give way to divide and conquer?
Right. And I think like it seems like how they use the term schismogenesis in the book is like, oh, you know, those people, we're clearly not those people, so we're going to do the opposite or whatever. But like, what happens when it's a kind of schismogenesis that's imposed from some kind of top-down entity? Like, is that still schismogenesis if it's not coming from that people or that culture itself?
It does seem to be an issue of identity, right? Because I'm also, as you're saying that, Nate, I'm also thinking about, you know, the Ottomans and and somebody mentioned Genghis Khan. Mike, did you mention Genghis Khan? These very big, the land empires, right? The very big land empires that were very cosmopolitan, where there was a lot, they were multi-ethnic, they were multiracial, they tolerated religions, right? Because they didn't give a shit as long as you paid your taxes. So it does seem like, we also get this development. I mean, historically, we also get this kind of development of the idea of nationalism and the people or the folk, in German unification, narrative and all of that. There's a lot. Yeah. So there's a lot of complexity. There's a lot of remaining complexity above and beyond, I guess, the thing. I mean, maybe that's my takeaway is that they take down, they do a great job as Graeber did of taking down the myths of economics and debt. He does a great job of taking down the myths of sociology and anthropology in this, but that still leaves people with a project to figure out what to put in its place.
To go back to Nate's question earlier and to put us back to Simon's question about Obsidian. So I've taken a bunch of notes, and this was a good read just to read for itself. But I also have been doing a lot of work in anthropology and the ideas of orality and how ancient cultures and societies work. So this has expanded my reading list dramatically and also reframed some of it. And I think some of what they've written, actually, I was already to some of their argument based on other things in the anthropology literature, which are incredibly new, and I'm dead certain they have not read or considered, and certainly didn't quote. So I'm going to integrate a lot of this into some of those other arguments, which makes it useful to me on a separate level other than having read it either for the book club or for just general life. And it's been an interesting experience seeing other people's notes and takes and what they find interesting. Although I would have liked more people to have brought in things from other things they read into how this gets affected within what we're reading here. And I think I did that purposely 2 or 3 times, but I'm not sure that I saw others doing it at all, which would have been kind of cool to see. Like, how, when the rubber meets the road, how does this work with other things in the area? But I think given the diversity of people here who perhaps haven't read all those other things, that becomes a harder topic to do. Whereas maybe, for Dan in a class reading over a semester or multiple semesters, you can have ideas from different things colliding in a bigger thing like this. And, we just had the 6 weeks. So
Yeah. Yeah. I at the beginning, I tried to like import in a couple of things, from my own vault. But like the James Scott stuff and the radical enlightenment stuff. But yeah, it did seem like that was not, that didn't get as much traction as it might have gotten. I also think that, and Nate, to respond directly to your question, I think that the problem with going another week is that we are running out of energy. I mean, and every time I look in the vault, there's like less change. So I'm not sure, what type of traction we would get out of another week talking about Obsidian and the thing itself.
Well, yeah, like Chris just mentioned in the chat, like, this has been enough reading for me. Like, right. I'm super curious how y'all engage in scholarship and do like time management more generally, because like, so reading it is one thing, like taking notes, putting things into Obsidian, that's a whole nother beast, which I'm still very much trying to wrap my head around. But then the collaborative vault is like this whole other like continuously expanding text that is fascinating. Like, I can't tell you, like, if I had spent less time going down crazy interesting rabbit holes, like getting lost on Chris's website for like 6 fucking hours. Yeah. Well, it's I'm really curious, Chris, like, how do you what do you do for work to support your reading habit? I mean, because I have like many of your interests are also my interests. I'm also from Monrovia, by the way, which is right next door to where you're currently apparently miserably
living. It's obvious, but I'm in Altadena, so you're super close.
Right. Well, I don't live there anymore. Now I live in Minnesota, but my parents still live there. I'm very familiar with Altadena. Yeah, I mean, I think the lift is heavy, but I think what makes me think that maybe another week would be warranted is just a week to like think about and process the vaults, mm-hmm. and then come specifically talk about that. I think would be super interesting. And I think that even though like, number of changes or whatever might be diminishing, I think now like it's like personal style of vault engagement is like much more clear now. Like, I love how Simon has organized his section, and I would love to hear like more about how you came to that style and how you put that style to work for you. I don't know, just throwing it out there. I think this has been a tremendous experience. I've learned a lot. I'm going to be thinking about this stuff for probably the rest of my life. And yeah, like, part of me is like already nostalgic and doesn't want it to end.
Well, I will, I tell you what I'll do. I will take a poll in the community dialogue, and if people want to do it, I'll do it.
I don't know. I don't know if it's just me either, but there are now, or at least I see a bunch of conflicted copies and duplicates of things, or even duplicates of folders. And I've been tempted to like spend an hour or two to compare them all and mm-hmm. pare it down to the brass tacks. But I'm also worried too that there are a handful of people out there with their vaults still open. And then when I make those changes, they're not going to propagate through, and instead it'll make 4 more copies of things instead of fewer copies.
Yeah, I was going to do that. I've been sort of dragging my feet on doing that, going back through and pruning out the conflicted copies, just because I thought, well, probably people are slowing down in their usage, and I was going to leave it open for a couple of weeks anyway, just so that because a couple of people have expressed the idea that they want to kind of go in and put some finishing touches on things, and and look at what other people have done and their kind of final stuff, and then after a couple weeks from today, my idea was I would move it to publish or something like that. I can, but we can, yeah, I'm happy to talk again next week if we want to, talk about sort of how, now that we've done the book, we can talk about the vault, we can talk about the, about the process, and yeah, and all of that. That'd be cool with me.
I found it really interesting that at the beginning, I actually found it a bit overwhelming, and also because this is not my field, I'm not even close, that I didn't feel like I had the confidence at all to contribute to conversations about, let's say the veracity of an anthropological text, for example. And then the other thing that happened at the same time was a lot of people, I don't know how many people, but it seemed like it was a really strong desire to organize the vault in a very particular way with lots of folders. And of course, then I sort of had this feeling like there was a kind of I wouldn't call it top down, but it was a sort of sense that there were some people, it was curious, and particularly in reading a book where there was going, what other ways might social structures be organized to that feeling where everyone was going, this is how this vault should be organized, and this is how this vault should be organized, and so I found that I enjoyed the kind of irony of that.
Yeah.
But it was also with folders, and because my vault, I don't have folders, and so as soon as I saw folders, I went, where do I start? I had no idea how I did find things, and Maggie's ongoing thing was a sort of a godsend, really, because it would just enable me to keep a sense of what things were being changed. But yeah, so I actually found it overwhelming as a sort of a collaborative space, if that's what we want to call it, or a shared space. Don't mean that as a criticism. That was just a sort of a feeling, really, which was
going back into the history of note-taking or commonplacing. There were a few people in the 1500s who kept voluminous piles of notes, and because they had done them and built up the memory and knowledge of which heaps of paper they kept certain notes in, it's like some people have a messy desk and they know where everything is on that messy desk.
Mm-hmm.
When you bring 10 other people in after the fact, they don't have that context, so they're totally stuck. Right. So, I think culturally, from an organizational standpoint, we're heavily mired in, and it even goes back to the book, hierarchies of folders and where you're going to put things so that they're easily findable by 30 other people you're sharing a space with. Mm-hmm. Helps. But, part of the point of some of these systems, or the idea of the Zettelkasten from the German perspective, you should be able to have just this massive pile, and by interlinking things, you'll find the things you need or that you're interested in. But I don't think as a group, enough of us, of the 50 or so, have enough experience with that perspective, or the one that Simon mentioned. He doesn't have any folders at all. It's just a big, massive pile. But because he's the only one putting things into that pile, he roughly knows what's there or what's not there. And he may find a year or two from now, he's forgotten what he put in there, and he'll be surprised by it. Mm-hmm. And find kind of new value in some of those things or those links.
Yeah.
But I don't think as, modern humans, we can construct that same way when you get to
the only thing about
30 or more.
The only thing about that, of course, is sorry, Chris. It's just that, I think what you said, I think it's really interesting, but also that thing at the beginning where you go, how is it that you might construct a system that a whole group of other people would understand? Like, it reminds me of when you're trying to change the rear view mirror for someone else when it's not you, or it's not really possible, because our capacity to, again, this is a sort of a theme of the book in a way. In fact, one of the strong themes of me is this extraordinary dignity that they treat the past with a sort of extraordinary amount of respect, and the people in it with dignity. And so, but that is a very complex thing you're asking someone or a group of people to do, to organize us, to make a system that other people will come to. Think of everyone's SharePoint folder directories at work. I mean, they're just a nightmare. No one knows where anything is. Again, not a criticism, but yeah, it's
to me, this comes back to, social network or societal network and knowledge network. To me, there is a very clear analogy between them. So if I want to take something positive from the book, the answer would be, let's play with different knowledge structures. For 6 weeks, let's follow rules. It's not like we're not going to have rules, but for 6 weeks, let's follow some rules. And we'll say at the beginning, it'll be over in 6 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And then, 2 or 3 weeks, we can pause and then say, okay, now let's do 6 weeks with different rules. So here's how I view this stuff. And of course, just like everything else I say, I'm probably the only one who does this, but it's not my idea, right? Mortimer Adler and Charles Van Doren, we talked about how to read a book. So they have levels of analysis, just like you could have a Darwinian social levels of analysis with the individuals and then the family, and then there's groups, there's the towns, and there's the counties, and there's the states, and there's the regions, right? And there's multiple overlapping groups within a state and within the globe of, ultimately different ways to divide up the human species. So I would view different levels of analysis within a vault. You have terms or tags, and then you have sentences, which some people call settles or some people call permanent notes. And then for me, which I think is hugely important, is you not just connect tags to sentences, and you don't just connect one sentence to another sentence, but for me to really get insight, which is my goal as opposed to freedom, my goal is to get insight. So for me to have insight, I need to understand either the logical connection between two sentences or the causal connection between two sentences. So that's my view of things. I could be totally wrong. It might be completely infeasible socially. But if I were to adopt a Graeber-Wengrow viewpoint, I'd say, all right, let's try that for 6 weeks. And we all kind of agree. And then we'll say, what was fucked up about that? Should try something different.
If you think about it, even from a broader cultural perspective, almost everyone is using Google or a Google-based search engine. So you have a way of finding knowledge in the world, but generally you're looking at the top 10 results, and most people probably are not even going past the third or fourth result. So, exactly how interconnected can the world actually be if you're only looking at the top surface level, and you're never going to see that 10,000th result, which is probably the one you may actually want, because their problem space is geared towards the masses rather than, it's definitely not geared towards me. 9 times out of 10, I search for something and I use multiple Boolean operators and I narrow it down. And even then I got to go 10 pages in to find the thing that I know exists that I want to find. The only experience I think I've seen with a group who does this well, there's a community called the Indie Web, and they have a Wikimedia-based wiki that they add to, and attached to that is a live real-time chat that uses 7 different platforms that are all created as equals. So regardless of whether you want to use IRC or Matrix or Discord or Slack, whatever it is, they all work. And it creates one massive chat. So you can choose how you want to interact with it. But you can have discussions within the chat. And then when you're done with your discussion, ideally somebody will take the best salient points from that chat and move them to the wiki. And there's a hierarchy there to be able to find stuff. But to make things even easier, they have a chat bot that you can ask basic questions, and the chat bot will reply with links and short definitions that will point you to specific pages. so that as you start a chat, somebody will come in with a question about some topic, and then usually within a few minutes, somebody's going to ask the question for the chat bot to respond to say, here's our body of knowledge around this topic thus far. And then the question, you all now have a shared context, and then you can kind of move from there to figure out, how do we expand that body of knowledge, or how do we take this subsection of that page and expand on that? But it takes a lot of small incremental changes. But the tough part is, how do you quickly provide everybody with a similar context for the topic at hand, and then move on from there?
How do you get people up to speed?
I think the best thing I've seen from an organizational perspective, he works in physics and complexity theory as well as information theory, but there's an MIT professor, Cesar Hidalgo, who has a book called Why Information Matters. And he creates a hierarchy of, and some of it comes from Shannon's information theory of, what's the most information you can push through a channel? Mm-hmm. If you put that onto people, what's the most amount of information a single person can have? And he calls that a person byte. But each of us, and there's, seven of us here, so you can take 7 person bytes, but we can all collaborate to make even more information than any of us could singularly. But there's also then, from a complexity perspective, even more information than you would think 7 of us could collaborate on. And he calls that essentially a corporate byte or a company byte. So 7 people can come together, make a company, and then we have more information. And you keep building that up, and eventually get to something like the company Google is probably that next level up above the corporate level that becomes a societal level. And, how high up do those turtles go? I don't know, but it's an interesting theory to look at.
I just wanted to not miss the opportunity, and there's a slight jump cut from what you've just been talking about, Chris, but not miss the opportunity to thank you all, but also particularly Dan, just for making this happen. I know, because we're just sort of coming to the end, so I just really wanted to express my appreciation and just the pleasure of it, for listening to you all, and really, really totally appreciate it.
Well, thank you all for doing it. I think this has been, this is way more than I expected. It's been a whole lot more fun. It's gone in directions that I didn't anticipate. So yeah, it's been a blast.
So, and Dan, if you consider, expanding the time frame, what about the new thing that you mentioned on the video today morning? Yesterday. Oh,
the Aaron's Lumon thing.
Yeah.
I think I'll probably start that if I get if I get responses. If enough people want to do it, I'll probably start that, and that'll probably just be a 4-week February thing, because it's a much smaller. I mean, even if we read 2 articles, it's a much smaller book, and I think that it's much, and I think that it will probably be much more. It will end up being much more focused on the process and and the ideas of kind of note taking and all of that, rather than I mean, this Graeber and Wengrow stuff was crazy, man.
It was ambitious.
It was. Yeah.
They would have said in the 60s, heavy, man, heavy.
It was heavy. Yeah, it was heavy. And there's a lot, and there'll be a lot to unpack. I think I'm just going to keep, digging into little bits of it, following, I've been asking, I've been keeping my interlibrary loan people busy, asking for books, but that somebody needs to here. So full employment for ILL librarians. So so I guess we're kind of out of time. I will put a little question up on the community page, and if people want to talk more about about the process and about kind of how the how the vault continues to to settle it. I mean, I imagine it this week, over the course of the next 7 days, it will kind of settle, and there will be kind of a final form. And I will go in and prune. I mean, there are some folders even that I don't think really need to exist. So
well, I think, as part of like the archaeological record of the vault, I think it's really interesting that, some of that hierarchy was initially imposed with folders and subfolders, and then nobody used it. I think that's kind of beautiful.
Yeah, and then,
which folders did people find useful, and then those like filled out, and then
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it was kind of an interesting early kind of negotiation on because I went in with probably much less of a plan than I might have. And so we had a couple of weeks, the first week or 10 days or so of kind of negotiating, what we would do and stuff. I do like that, that some of these things did emerge, and some, and folders did happen, and some hierarchy happened, and that it wasn't entirely top down. I'm really fascinated, but we could go off on a tangent there. Just this whole idea of emerging structures, and how maybe, the map of content, if it happens after you've got 1,000, 1,000 nodes, is not such a bad thing. But
like Simon, I think I spent more time on that changelog page than any other page anywhere else.
Yeah. It's that really was a great contribution.
Yeah, I could imagine the first meeting, rather than the book just being being a meeting about, well, what would the rules be? If we're talking about having rules, like you can imagine, like, well, we need this rule for that. It's quite hilarious.
Yes.
And would we have built all three freedoms into the system?
Right.
Yes, and the freedom to move away.
And apparently, given how many people signed up and how many people participated, that was probably exercised as well.
There was at least one person who exercised their right to use logsec, and there's a huge amount of notes in a logsec folder.
Oh, are there? Okay, I haven't really even looked.
There's a logsec folder in there, and you open the folder and it's empty, or it appears to be empty from an Obsidian viewpoint. But if you look at it, you'll notice there are several hundred files in there.
It's got 282 files. Yeah.
So right. When I was going through, there were a few times where I would remove a folder or a page that was just empty for emptiness sake. So it's like, if you're going to create a folder and then not use it, that's silly.
Yeah. Like, is there anything in to be filed? No, there isn't. Yeah. Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I hadn't, until I hovered over it, I didn't notice there were 282 files.
So now you've got way more reading now than you thought you did before.
I thought I did, yeah. So
there's material you just haven't seen.
Yep, turtles all the way down. All right. Well, I'm going to say thank you very much. I appreciate it. I will, I will post a little question, and maybe we'll meet again. And if not, thank you. This was a blast.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, everyone. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, this has been awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks, everyone. Totally appreciate it.
It's been great.
Ciao.
All right. Take care.